Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to see you here this morning. It's a great pleasure to be at Vet this year presenting for Open Source Schools, which is Vector's supported project, and informing the UK education community about the benefits and the advantages of open source software. On the panel today, we've got myself. I'm Miles Berry. I'm the head teacher of Alton Convent Prep, which is a small girls' boys' prep school in Alton, Hampshire. I've been using open source for quite a number of years now. We've got Michelle Walters from Chesham High School, she's the deputy head there. We've got Jose Picardo from Nottingham High School and Doug Belshaw from Ridgewood School. I'd like to start by telling you a little about what open source software is. Really, open source software is software where you've got access to the source code. With any bit of software, any program, you've got the stuff that makes it work, which is compiled down and interpreted, and then the program that runs on your machine. And normally, with software, with proprietary software, you get a license to run a compiled version. With open source software, you get the original instruction set too. So you can get in there, have a look at how it works, have a look at how it's doing what it does, change that, adapt it, make it fit what you want to do in your school. If you've got the technical expertise, contribute your ideas into the project itself. The way we really understand open source software in school, though, is as free software. Software which you can download off the net, don't have to pay for stuff. It's there, it's free, as in free beer. So it's there, there's no cost for it. The whole total cost of ownership thing we'll come back to in a moment, but you're not having to pay a license to use the software. When we talk about free software, we're making reference to this free beer idea. There's no cost involved with the license to run, to use, to access the software. But we're also talking about the idea of software which embodies the notion of freedom. We're talking about free as in free speech. And free software that's built on that idea of freedom, is a big part of what open source software is about. And we think really in terms of four freedoms. Firstly, of course, you're free to run the program. You're free to do what you want with the program. There is no restrictive license about you're only allowed to install it on one machine, you're only allowed to use it for this period of time without paying for maintenance fees. All of that doesn't apply to open source software. You have the freedom to run the program whatever way you want. You also have, because you've got access to the source code there, the freedom to study how the program works. You can look at the way it's doing what it does. You've got that access to the source code. You can see why the program is working the way it is. You're also, this is really important from a school's point of view, free to redistribute the program to whoever you want. Another of these freedoms is associated with open source software. And this is important for schools because you can distribute to your pupils copies of the same software that they're using in school without having to worry about pupil access licenses, without having to worry about license audits, and give them a disk, give them a USB stick with exactly the same programs as they're using in your IT room in school, with your laptops in school. They've got access to the same programs at home for free. And I think particularly in the present economic climate, them being able to use all of that software legally, freely, that they're using in school is a really good thing. Also, again, because of this access to the source code, you're free to improve the program. You can become part of the developer community, you can suggest ideas into that community. You've got access to that original source code, you can change the way the program works, you can make it better. And being part of that project, often worldwide, liaising with other developers, with educators and educationalists around the world about making that program work better. There's a great freeing up sort of thing. Again, for some sixth form students, perhaps particularly doing A-levels in computing, being able to access that source code, what a wonderful opportunity that brings. So there are the advantages, as well as this sort of freedom stuff. We've got this notion of adaptability, that the software, you've got absolute control over what you do with that software. So if you're using Moodle, if you're using any of the other web-based applications, and you don't like the way it does something, you can get in there, have a look at the source code, edit that code, make it do things differently. A lot of the software we're talking about is built on a very modular framework, so easy enough path in to starting to write modules to extend the functionality of that program. Again, share those modules worldwide with the rest of the community that's gathered around that bit of software. The cost obviously. There is no charge for the license to use the software, to have access to that source code. But in terms of total cost of ownership, there also appear to be very significant savings too. Better did a study of this, I think it was back in 2005, comparing the total cost of ownership of computing in schools which are using open source software with those which are relying on proprietary code, and found not only savings in terms of software licenses, but also savings in terms of training costs, support costs, and savings in terms of hardware. So significant savings about the total expenditure on computing by moving towards an open source platform or increasing the amount of open source software used inside a school setting. Another real advantage is this participation in a community, that you are part of this worldwide network. And being part of that community is a very liberating thing. It's this sense of putting something back into software. Rather than just, here's the money, let me use the software. This idea of participation, of being part of a network around that community, the ideas and the extending use of that. And of course you get that with some proprietary projects too, but open source is very much built on this notion of a community of people gathered around software. And those of us who have at the heart of our educational philosophy social constructivism, social constructionism, this ties in so closely with that sort of approach to education. So for me personally, it's a philosophical link between how I view education and how we use open source software. It's very close and important. Sustainability. Open source software generally won't need as high a specification of machine to run on, so you can continue to use hardware that you bought 3 years ago that might not run the latest version of the proprietary operating system, but it will be run very happily with open source operating systems. We're using machines which, until last year, we were using machines which were over 5 years old as thin clients in our prep school IT room. One big powerful server, and then these machines which would otherwise have been thrown away, continuing to do sterling service, providing an 18-seat IT room, very, very little cost, because we reuse the machines which otherwise would have been thrown away. And open source, really importantly for us, I'd say, is about education. And what we're looking for is not simply training our students to use particular versions of Office application suites. We're about giving them an education and understanding of ICT at a far deeper level than that. And the flexibility of mind and ability to compare, contrast different operating systems, application suites, programs. Really valuable skill for our children, our students to have. Open source also provides one way of getting innovation into schools. If you're interested in social networking, you're not happy about letting them out using Facebook, using Bebo, using MySpace in a school setting, you get something like OWL, open source social networking platform, install it on your own web server, and you can do all of this really cutting edge Web 2 stuff inside the school network. There are so many open source projects there which let you be at absolutely the cutting edge of technology. So they're being developed by people with a real passion for this stuff, who've not had to make a business case. They're enthusiastic about what they're doing, and they're sharing that with this worldwide open source community, and the chance for a school to be part of that, I think is a tremendous opportunity.